Julius Caesar was not just Joseph Mankiewicz's most improbable commercial success. It was a Cold War political warning dressed in Roman togas made for $1,900,000 with recycled sets from a biblical epic nobody wanted to be compared to. Produced by a man who had built his career alongside Orson Welles and was now quietly erasing Welles's shadow from the most famous Shakespeare production in American history, and built around a casting decision so universally mocked before filming began that the studio kept a British replacement standing by in case Brando opened his mouth and nothing came out. We are digging into the wreckage of William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar with 20 dark secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside, producer memoirs, House Un-American Activities Committee transcripts, Shakespearean stage histories, and the biographical archives of people who were simultaneously living inside the history they were depicting. The film's official on-screen title is not Julius Caesar. It is William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a designation whose presence on the opening frame performs a specific institutional act never adequately examined. The studio's insistence on crediting Shakespeare was not cultural reverence. It was a defensive maneuver. By foregrounding the literary source, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was distancing the film from any suggestion that its portrait of a charismatic despot surrounded by institutional cowardice and manufactured popular consensus was a commentary on living men. The word Shakespeare's was a shield. Behind it, Houseman and Mankiewicz had made a film about how a republic dismantles itself, the psychology of political flattery, the corruption of public language, the manipulation of grief into mob energy, as directly relevant to the United States in 1953 as to the Rome of 44, before Christ. The bard's name was the alibi. The argument was Mankiewicz's and Houseman's. John Houseman arrived at William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, carrying the most consequential piece of personal history any producer had ever brought to a Shakespeare adaptation. He had co-produced, with Orson Welles in 1937, the definitive modern American staging of the same play, the Mercury Theater production that set Julius Caesar in fascist black shirts and Nazi armbands, used Nuremberg rally lighting as set design vocabulary, and ran for 157 performances as the most culturally resonant Shakespeare production in North American history. By 1953, the falling out with Welles was complete and irreversible, a rupture that had calcified into what his biographers describe as lifelong hostility. Houseman had provided information to Pauline Kael for Raising Cain that other accounts characterized as false or misleading, deliberately designed to minimize Welles's contribution to his own greatest film. The man producing Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was the man who had made the definitive American Julius Caesar 16 years earlier, and who had spent the intervening years systematically attempting to reduce his former partner's reputation. Welles had nothing to do with the 1953 film. The ghost of the 1937 production was present in every creative decision Houseman made, and was never acknowledged. The screenplay credit reads, "From the play by William Shakespeare." No living writer's name appears. What production records reveal is that Mankiewicz wrote a substantial adaptation, cutting the play, restructuring scenes, adding stage directions for cinematic action, making specific decisions about what to preserve and what to excise without a word of official credit. His most consequential decision was the fourth act, where Shakespeare relies on messenger speeches to convey the Battle of Philippi. Mankiewicz filmed the battle, adding a visual dimension the play never possessed and overriding his own stated preference for a wholly theatrical production. He had wanted a film contained by Shakespeare's language. The studio wanted spectacle. Mankiewicz gave them both, and received no credit for the hours of adaptation work that produced the balance. The film that won the Academy Award for Best Art Direction was built on an uncredited screenplay, and the man who made Shakespeare legible to American audiences in 1953 was listed beneath a man dead for 3.5 centuries. Paul Scofield stood in readiness throughout the pre-production period as Mankiewicz's contingency plan, the British classical actor who would be available to take the role of Mark Antony if Brando's audio demonstrations proved unconvincing. The arrangement was not an afterthought. It was a formal preparation for institutional failure, a contingency plan written into the production's creative architecture before a single word of Shakespeare had been spoken on tape. What Scofield represented was not merely an alternative casting option, but an alternative conception of what the film should be. A British-inflected classical performance alongside the film's other classically trained British actors, a coherent ensemble of trained Shakespearean speaking verse in the same tradition. The film that Scofield would have made was not the film Brando made. The film Brando made created a collision of traditions, method naturalism against classical declamation, American physicality against British vocal precision, that produced something no homogeneous ensemble could have generated. Scofield never played the role. The contingency plan was never activated, but Mankiewicz's readiness to activate it tells you precisely how confident he was at the start of production that the 28-year-old man, known publicly as the Mumbler, would deliver what the role required. Brando had refused a screen test, constitutionally opposed to the practice. He agreed instead to make audio recordings demonstrating his ability to handle Shakespeare's verse. Mankiewicz listened to the first recordings and told Brando he sounded just like June Allyson, the mild-voiced Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer ingenue, whose screen persona was the precise opposite of every quality Mark Antony required. The comparison was specific. Brando was not merely wrong, he was wrong in a way that named the exact deficit, the softness that would make the Friends, Romans, countrymen speech actively embarrassing in the context of a classically trained ensemble. Mankiewicz then worked with Brando directly on a recording of Antony's Senate entrance speech. The resulting tape was sufficient. Gielgud subsequently spent hours coaching Brando in verse delivery, a generosity Houseman called rare among actors, and that produced the most technically improbable collaboration in the history of Shakespearean cinema. Gielgud was so impressed by Brando's dedication that he offered to direct him in a stage production. Brando declined. He had taken what Gielgud offered, returned it in the performance, and that was the full extent of his interest in the theatrical tradition. The visual architecture of William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was built substantially from the physical remains of Quo Vadis, the 1951 Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Technicolor epic set in Nero's Rome, filmed in Italy at enormous cost. Several Quo Vadis sets had been deconstructed, crated, shipped to California, and rebuilt on Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's Culver City backlot. Houseman's explicit reasoning for refusing color, documented in his own words, was partly that the production would be using a lot of the Quo Vadis sets, and it seemed idiotic to invite comparison. The black and white decision critics praised as aesthetically sophisticated and politically resonant was partly a practical strategy to prevent audiences from noticing that the forum where Caesar was assassinated had recently hosted. Deborah Kerr, Converting to Christianity. The art direction that won the Academy Award was constructed on recycled infrastructure from a film the production was actively trying to distinguish itself from, photographed in a format that made the comparison invisible. The Oscar went to Cedric Gibbons and Edward Carfagno. It might reasonably have been shared with the Quo Vadis construction crew. In the scene set at Brutus's house, a bust of the Emperor Hadrian gazes down at the proceedings. Hadrian was born in 76 Anno Domini, approximately 120 years after the events the film depicts. The anachronism was identified by a historian reviewing the production's period authenticity and noted without consequence. The bust remained in the finished film. No reshooting occurred. The art direction department that won the Academy Award for its visual recreation of Republican Rome had placed a portrait of a man not born for another century and a quarter in the production's most intimate domestic space, and neither the Academy nor any reviewer who praised the film's visual authority noticed. Hadrian watches Brutus plan the assassination of a Caesar who died before Hadrian's father was born. The anachronism is still there, in every print, on every streaming platform, quietly observing the conspiracy with the expression of a man who already knows how it ends. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's original preference, documented in Houseman's autobiography, was Technicolor. Color was the studio's prestige format in 1953. It announced production investment in a way black and white no longer did. Houseman and Mankiewicz refused. Their documented reasoning was dual. The recycled Quo Vadis sets would expose their origins immediately in color, and, the reasoning the studio's marketing division never advertised, they wanted people to relate to the newsreels, to the fascist movements in Europe, which were still relevant. The black and white decision was a formal choice to make Caesar's Rome legible as a 20th century political environment, rather than historical spectacle. It connected the Roman Forum to Nuremberg through the shared visual grammar of documentary footage. Houseman had made the same connection 16 years earlier with Welles, using Nuremberg rally lighting as set design. He was making it again, without crediting the earlier occasion, without advertising to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer that the film they were financing was a deliberate attempt to make fascism legible through classical verse. The specific Cold War argument William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was making in 1953 was not available to most of its audience in the terms in which it was being made. Houseman and Mankiewicz had decided to film Shakespeare's text as what Houseman explicitly called a political thriller, a drama of political power play stripped of its period grandeur. How a charismatic strong man accumulates authority, how the institutions that exist to check that authority fail to deploy it, how men who oppose him convince themselves assassination is principled rather than political, and how the language of grief and loyalty is systematically converted into mob control. Every element had direct contemporary application in 1953, to McCarthy, to loyalty oaths, to the conversion of Republican institutions into instruments of ideological enforcement. The film made this argument in blank verse, set in ancient Rome, under the protective shield of Shakespeare's name, at a studio whose head of production, Dor Sherry, had authorized the production without being told explicitly what it was about. Houseman and Mankiewicz sold Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a classical literary adaptation. They delivered a film about how republics dismantle themselves. The studio never entirely understood what it had greenlit. John Houseman died on October 31, 1988, the 50th anniversary of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, the Mercury Theater production that had made Welles the most famous entertainer in America overnight. Houseman had co-produced that broadcast. He had spent the subsequent decades in Welles' shadow, winning his own Academy Award in 1974 for The Paper Chase, founding the Juilliard School of Drama, while remaining, in the public imagination, the man who had worked with Orson Welles. Whether his death date is biographical irony or cosmic annotation depends on your tolerance for coincidence. What it cannot be is insignificant. The man who spent 40 years trying to establish himself as something other than Welles' former collaborator died on the anniversary of Welles' most spectacular achievement. Every obituary's opening sentence wrote itself. He could not escape the collaboration he had spent a career trying to supersede. The date made that permanent. Among the cast is John Hoyt, playing Decius Brutus, the conspirator who persuades Caesar to attend the Senate on the Ides of March. Hoyt had played the same role in Orson Welles' 1937 Mercury Theater production. He was a living connection between the suppressed predecessor and the official production, a man whose body had been in both versions of the same scene, 16 years apart, under radically different creative leadership, with radically different ideological staging. Houseman cast him, presumably knowing the biographical detail and aware of what that casting communicated to anyone who knew the history. Hoyt subsequently played Dr. Philip Boyce in The Cage, the pilot episode of Star Trek, a historical irony that closes a loop. The man who played a Roman conspirator in Welles' anti-fascist production reprised the same role in Houseman's Cold War thriller, and then appeared in the television franchise that The Enemy Below had inadvertently helped inspire. The production's most explicit acknowledgement that the Mercury Theater had ever existed was a man playing the same role for the second time in a production that publicly denied the first had occurred. Despite the recycled sets, black and white stock, Culver City backlot, and institutional determination to make a small production rather than a spectacle, William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar was the third most expensive film Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer produced in 1953. The Battle of Philippi, filmed at Bronson Caverns, a location Turner Classic Movies production notes describe as reminiscent of Monument Valley, and where a portion of The Searchers was subsequently filmed, consumed a significant portion of the supposed economies. The film that was designed to be inexpensive was simply less expensive than it might have been. The $1,900,000 budget Houseman had pitched as evidence of the production's humility was the studio's third largest expenditure that year. What the budget records cannot capture is the ancillary cost. The decades of school screenings that the theatrical release made possible, the institutional infrastructure of educational licensing that eventually generated the profit Houseman suspected, had exceeded anything else he made. The theatrical run recovered modestly. The gymnasium screenings recovered everything else. William Tuttle, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's head of makeup, fitted Brando with a latex prosthetic nose, slightly larger than his own, designed to give him a more heroically Roman profile. The test was shot, reviewed, and discarded. Brando appeared in the finished film with his own nose. The decision reflects a specific understanding of what his casting was supposed to accomplish. Not assimilation into a coherent historical visual style, but the maintenance of Brando's specific physical identity as the element creating productive friction with the film's classically trained British ensemble. The prosthetic nose would have made Brando look Roman. Rejecting it kept him looking like Brando, and the anachronism of his appearance, his American physicality in a toga, was the film's central productive tension. Tuttle gave the full Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer glamour treatment to Garson and Kerr. He let Brando be exactly what he was. Production correspondence documents a disagreement between Mankiewicz's instincts and the studio's commercial requirements, resolved in the studio's favor. Mankiewicz had wanted a film completely theatrical, contained by Shakespeare's language, without the visual expansion into battle sequences that the fourth act's messenger speeches could have sustained within theatrical convention. The Battle of Philippi, that appears in the finished film shot at Bronson Caverns, praised by some reviewers and criticized by others as an awkward shift in visual grammar, was not Mankiewicz's preferred conclusion. The director chosen specifically because Houseman considered him one of the two best dialogue directors in the business had been overruled in his preference for dialogue over imagery at precisely the film's climax. The battle scene is competent. It is also a compromise, and the specific compromises of great directors made under institutional pressure are the deepest wounds in the films that survive them. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's institutional preference, documented in Houseman's autobiography and overruled by his explicit argument, was for an all-British ensemble. The studio executives had concluded that Shakespeare required British voices and theatrical training. Houseman's counter-argument shaped the film. He had done Shakespeare in America, he knew it worked in American mouths, and if Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer wanted an all-British cast, the film should be made in Europe by a British company, not by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in Culver City. The mixed cast that resulted produced the productive collision no homogeneous ensemble could have manufactured. But the institutional logic Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had applied was not merely a prestige reflex. It was the same assumption that had kept Shakespeare largely out of American cinema for decades, that classical verse was a British property, that American voices could not carry it. Houseman overruled it. Brando demonstrated its error. The studio that preferred a British cast was represented at the Academy Awards by a Best Actor nomination for The American in the Toga. What no Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer press release, publicity photograph, or production note ever acknowledged was the existence of the Welles-Houseman 1937 Mercury Theater production, the one Houseman had personally co-created, that remained the most celebrated American Shakespeare staging of the 20th century, and that had made the specific interpretive choice, fascist uniform, Nuremberg lighting, modern political allegory, that Mankiewicz and Houseman were now translating into film. The Mercury production was the direct creative ancestor of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer film. Its anti-fascist argument was the same argument the film was making in different register. Its cast alumnus John Hoyt was in the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer film playing the same role. Its producer was now the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer film's producer, and it was never mentioned. The press materials presented William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar as responding to Olivier's Henry V, not as Houseman's second production of the same play, informed by 16 years of thinking about what the first had achieved. The deliberate erasure of the Mercury precedent was Houseman's most consequential act of institutional self-presentation, and it has shaped how the film has been understood ever since. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's own records document a profit of $116,000 on William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar's initial theatrical release, modest for a $1,900,000 budget. Houseman said in 1976 that he suspected it had finally made more money than any other picture he made. That distinction was achieved not through the theatrical run, but through decades of school screenings, television broadcasts, and educational licensing. William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar became, by the late 1950s, the standard American high school Shakespeare film the text English teachers screened when the class reached Julius Caesar in the curriculum. The audience that the theatrical release had modestly assembled was dwarfed by the captive audience of teenagers who watched Brando's funeral oration in gymnasiums for the following 30 years. The commercial failure of the initial release was the precondition for the cultural saturation that made the film's argument about the manipulation of public grief permanently available to American students. The teachers screened it as Shakespeare. The film was simultaneously teaching civics, and neither the teachers nor the students, nor the studio that owned the print, knew which lesson was taking root. The casting of Edmund O'Brien as Casca, the most consistently underexamined performance in a film whose attention has been monopolized by Brando, Gielgud, and Mason, represents a productive miscasting so specific it accidentally generates the film's most unsettling characterization. O'Brien was an actor whose quality, the sweating, barely contained anxiety of a man who knows more than he wants to know, had been most precisely deployed in D.O.A., where he played a man investigating his own poisoning. He brings that quality to Casca, the conspirator as a man always slightly too aware of what is happening, who delivers his satirical account of Caesar refusing the crown with the nervous precision of someone managing his proximity to violent men by performing harmlessness. It is not the Casca of the classical stage tradition. It is the Casca of the noir thriller. No director trained in classical repertory would have arrived at this Casca. O'Brien arrived at him because he was the actor he was, and Mankiewicz was smart enough to let him be it. The critical reception in June 1953 was generous, technically admiring, and almost entirely focused on the wrong argument. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times called it an altogether stirring and admirable work, praising the black and white decision and Brando's performance at length. The entire critical conversation centered on whether Brando could do Shakespeare, whether he had done Shakespeare, whether what he had produced constituted Shakespeare in the sense the tradition required. None of the reviews addressed the Cold War argument. None identified the political resonance of a story about institutional failure, manufactured popular consent, and the conversion of public grief into mob violence. Released in the year McCarthy's committee was testing the Senate's integrity and the Rosenberg's execution was demonstrating exactly the kind of political urgency that Shakespeare's language had always been available to carry. The critics reviewed the performance. They did not review the polemic in every scene Mankiewicz had directed in the newsreel grammar Houseman had specified. The 70-year distance from its release has stripped away the Cold War specificity and revealed the permanent argument underneath, that the rhetoric of popular sovereignty is always potentially a tool of demagogic manipulation, that the funeral oration is always also the recruiting speech, that the man who says he comes not to praise Caesar, but to bury him, always comes to praise him, and that the crowd weeping for a murdered leader in the morning can be burning senatorial houses by afternoon. Antony's address over Caesar's body is not a set piece from a history play. It is a technical manual for converting grief into political violence. Shakespeare knew this in 1599. Mankiewicz knew it in 1953. Every generation of American students who watched Brando perform it in a gymnasium received a demonstration of the mechanism, usually without being told what they were watching. The film screened as a safe literary adaptation was teaching its audience, with every screening, how popular fury is manufactured from legitimate grief. That lesson has not aged. The blank verse is still the most efficient delivery mechanism available. The film that survived made over the objection of color, built from Quo Vadis sets, uncredited for its adaptation, nominated for 5 Academy Awards and winning 1, protecting its political argument behind Shakespeare's name, launched into American high school classrooms, where it performed its civic function for 30 years without anyone advertising what that function was, is the most consequential piece of American political cinema never discussed, as political cinema. Mankiewicz fought the studio over color and won. He lost the battle sequence fight. Houseman erased Welles from the genealogy and placed John Hoyt in the cast as the only honest acknowledgement a prior version existed. Brando sounded like June Allyson on the first tape and delivered one of the 10 greatest performances in the history of Shakespearean cinema on the last day of shooting. Gielgud coached his method co-star and offered him a stage production. Brando declined. And every American who ever sat in a gymnasium watching Antony work the crowd over Caesar's body received a lesson in the mechanism of political manipulation embedded in the script before the studio could identify it clearly. Enough to object. But here is the question Julius Caesar leaves inside every repetition of that word honorable, as it turns from tribute to accusation. If the most efficient demonstration of how public language is weaponized against the population, it pretends to serve delivered to captive American teenagers for 70 years under the label of literary education, was made by 2 men who hid its argument behind a dead playwright's name at a studio that never entirely understood what it had greenlit, then what does that tell you about where the real political education of a democracy has always taken place? And if the answer is that it has always taken place in spaces officially designated for something else, which film playing right now is teaching your children something the institution that funded it has not identified and could not stop if it had? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Julius Caesar, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.